Hello, welcome to SAR. I'm Morris Foster, I'm the president, and this is our first Humanities Festival event of the next 2 weeks. And I did want to remind you that in addition to Alex's lecture tonight, there's going to be a member discussion and listening session with Alex tomorrow morning here in the boardroom. Coffee reception starts at 10 and the session starts at 10:30, and Mary tells me we have plenty of room for that. So please come. Yes, a much more of a back and forth and maybe more music, although we'll see how much we get tonight. So let me talk a little bit about Alex. Alex Chávez is a critically acclaimed ethnomusicologist and performer. His acclaimed album, Sonorous Present, began as an experimental and improvised performance inspired by the music and poetics of his multi-award-winning book, Sounds of Crossing, Music Migration, and the Aural Poetics of Huapango, Arribeño. Is it close enough? Arribeño, thank you. Through integration of a range of scholarly disciplines and communities of artistic practice, this multimodal scholarly work uniquely integrates regional Mexican and Latin American sonic elements with field recordings and ethnographic songwriting drawn from years of research across the U.S. Mexico border and his personal experiences of loss. Alex is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Notre Dame, where he also is a faculty fellow of the Institute for Latino Studies. He's composed documentary scores for Emmy Award-winning films, worked closely with Smithsonian Folkways, and collaborated with Grammy Award-winning and Grammy Award-nominated artists. He is a co-editor of the volume Ethnographic Refusals, Unruly Latinadas, which grows out of an SAR seminar that he co-chaired here, and that was published in 2022. His current book project, Sound City, Place, Poetics, Chicago? Yep. Okay. Is forthcoming from Duke University Press. So I'd like you to, if you don't mind, silence your cell phones, and please welcome Alex Chávez.
Okay, here we go. Well, first of all, thank you to Mary Madigan and here we go. Hear that? Thank you to Mary Madigan, Paul Ryer, for their gracious invitation at first to reaching out. And I think our experience together was kind of doing the work around the seminar, which I believe was in 2019-ish. The book came out in 2022, but it was this gathering of all Latino anthropologists here at SAR. Which is a really wonderful experience, and it yielded that volume in terms of a lot of people doing amazing anthropological ethnographic work that was unprecedented. I don't think a gathering like that had ever happened at SAR. And so it was a well past time. And so we were here, we did that, we published that book, and I have not been here since. So I appreciate the gracious invitation to be here. Thank you to Morris and, of course, all the SAR staff organizing the Humanities Festival. And so a couple of prefatory notes. One, there will be more music tomorrow. There will actually be performance, all right? And there will be more discussion of the book that was mentioned, the Sounds of Crossing book. I gestured toward it today, but it's not necessarily something that I'm quite focused on. And I think, you know, it's good to be back in Santa Fe. I spent half the day kind of wandering around, taking in the sights, and it's just lovely to be back. You know, this particular project I'm going to be speaking about in a way is, it's interesting. It sort of dovetails what I did for my first book, and in some ways in this, which is mentioned now, this other book, my second book, which is coming out on Duke, which is about sound and aurality in the city of Chicago. When I was here at the seminar, the chapter that was part of that book was a sort of one particular register of sound that I wrote about in the context of that work. And my point being that between then and doing the work here and sort of continuing to do ethnographic work, across borders and in my current kind of field site, Chicago, that this particular project you're about to hear about sort of emerges. For a number of reasons, as a kind of prefatory note here. One, I'm an artist. You know, people always ask me, how do you balance doing art and academia? It's like, I was an artist way before I became an academic. So this is me, right? And so it was a sort of a particular point in which I was able to sort of interface these, you know, these very specific aspects of my identity and what I do is my craft. And two, pandemic, right? And kind of that providing, for better or for worse, a particular space to think. And in my case, to really push at the edges of what scholarship is, right? And so this is kind of where I landed, okay? And so with that kind of prefatory note, I will get started, so. I'm in San Ciro, San Luis Potosí. It is mid-January. It's around 1 in the morning, and the temperature is just above freezing, and the ground trembles as I snake my way through the crowd of several hundred people on the street. A sea of dancers stomping and kicking up dirt, exposing the dry bones of the earth beneath our feet. And I brush past couples and briefly lock eyes with them as I wade through a fog of panting breaths, jostled about by the pounding rhythm of their patterned steps. The pulsing 6/8 strumming of Huapango music gives rise to an elaborate sonic filigree of violins. The deep subsonic sound rumbles in the pit of the stomach, beginning in the bowels and clamoring out through the chest. And for days now, this town has been in the midst of its spirited patron saint festivities. And tonight, the flickering lights of carnival booths and rides, they float like fireflies above the crowded fairgrounds and reach the congregation that is gathered on the outskirts of town, and I walk along tightly in between others, soaking in the smells of simmering and frying food from merchant stalls, the boisterous cackles and laughter of teenagers, the shouts of vendors calling out to passersby, the aroma of damp mesquite and tobacco drift by. The bitter scent of aguardiente, sugarcane liquor from someone's breath fills my nostrils. Meanwhile, the dancers bend long and pivot rapidly, their inertia extending out to different parts of their body, only to tumble back to its core, giving off heat, exchanging energy, carefully patterning their individual movements, shadowing those of others, heads bopping up and down, arms swinging, swaying, bottoms rocking back and forth, huffing and puffing along, and the steps grow louder, building a sonic wake that mirrors the music being vigorously bowed and strummed. Its tones sweep across the skin, and its utterances linger, caught in the air, fading but slowly as the poets improvise and musicians play, and the kinesthetic burning off of energy through dancing and listening to the point of exhaustion. Exhaustion lasting past sunrise. This exhaustion is slathered all over the entire space. These are those musicians. Now, this scene is drawn from my decade of research among Mexican migrant Huapango Arribeño musicians across Mexico and the United States, within the context of intensified attacks on their communities at the time, and the challenges of transnational migration. And most recently, we're witnessing similar challenges in this country. Mass deportations, efforts pulling children and students out of schools, families from their homes, and people from their places of work, zero-tolerance border enforcement policies being carried out by federal troops, et cetera, the list goes on. Footnote, I live in the city of Chicago. It's been in the news lately. Now, critical analysis of the U.S. Mexico border region have long understood it as a historical site of violence, wherein political technologies have enabled the hostile management, surveillance, and even killing of ethnic Mexicans since the 19th century. And also, nevertheless, to invoke Gloria Anzaldúa, the border region has also been considered a site of creative cultural production that merits investigation. And on this topic, anthropologist Gilberto Rosas, who's in that volume I was mentioning before, he cites the work of another anthropologist who's also been here at SAR, Renato Rosaldo. And he says this: in Rosaldo's hands, borders became more than stages, sites, or spectacles of state violence and exclusion. They reflected more than routine bureaucratic administration of state power, which borders in everyday life largely are. Borders bore theory. Borders, and notably their crossing, became critical apparatuses for mediating identities and mobilities. Borders were sites of complex intersubjective encounters of self and other, and particularly sites of creative cultural production. Culture had to be put in motion, and borders made up the key analytical locale for consideration of what that meant. Now, this is taken from Rosas' recent book, it's called Unsettling the El Paso Massacre, Resurgent White Nationalism in the U.S. Mexico Border. And there he writes, the horrific mass shooting that occurred on August 3rd, 2019 at the Walmart in El Paso, which is actually his hometown, marks the culmination of years of hardening the U.S. Mexico border and reflects how legal and extra-legal practices forge this and other contemporary international boundaries. They are inextricably tied to larger settler processes that underpin liberal societies, which border crossers, what do? They ultimately unsettle, end quote. So to further unpack these meanings and to paraphrase Rosas, among its many contributions, settler colonialist studies illuminate how settlers and their ancestors came to see themselves as natives, or how settler colonialism is integral to the complex dispositions of those seeking refuge. So today, borders and their crossers, and we see this all over their news, borders and their crossers, they provoke. They instigate borders and what they portend. In other words, they unsettle. They have become instrumental in national and global politics, where unfortunately, they're being portrayed as sites of racial invasion. And so, that's up here. Whereas the so-called illegal immigrant is mobilized in our American imagination to create fear or suspicion, and that music you just heard, I asked when I heard it, how did those poetics extend beyond that narrative space of illegality? What politics of visibility or belonging or intimacy did these practices perform vis-a-vis competing representations that were dominant around migrant personhood? And in pursuit of this and other questions, over the years, my research has extended well beyond the academy into adjacent forms of publicly engaged scholarship, cultural advocacy, and work with institutions like Smithsonian Folkways. So this is an album I produced for Folkways, and these are some of the musicians that I did years of research with in Mexico and the United States. And Guillermo Velázquez is the main practitioner's name here. And so I've continued to draw on these experiences to explore how sound and music are vital to situating the contemporary politics of the Latinx community within, at least in my opinion, the dynamic cultural field in which aurality and being heard are social embodiments for being in and claiming place. And just another quick footnote. So most of these photos you see here are all part of fieldwork that I've done for years, okay? So I try to label them here, try to accompany the theme. But yet sound is heard through culturally situated forms of listening. That is, that aural modes of attention, right? How we listen, circulate within social fields of meaning and power. That sound stimulates an auditory imagining in search of its source, an attunement linked to broader other kinds of engagements. In other words, that when we tune in, when we listen, all of that is comprised of culturally situated modes of attention that operate as sources of knowledge that are intent on, yes, we want to yield sonic focus, clarity, intelligibility. Like, what is this sound? But most critically, that intelligibility, that tuning in, is comprised of culturally situated modes of attention that are intent on rendering the source of sound decipherable in accordance with normative conceptions of rationality. This is to say that when we tune in, we try to rationalize. And this exercise gives rise to what's, in sound studies, what we call the acousmatic question. What is that question when we try to rationalize? Who is this? In The Race of Sound, Nina Edshim writes, quote, "The acousmatic situation arises from the assumption that voice and sound are of an a priori stable nature, a cue to interiority or essence," end quote. Yet, despite our search for reliable constructions of sonic origins, the voice and sonic identity are not situated as some sort of unified thing or locus. Right? Rather, they play out within anatomies of difference that are experienced in everyday interactions through other queries that amplify the acousmatic question of not just who is this, but where are you from? In Looking Like a Language, Sounding Like a Race, Jonathan Rosa, who also was part of this seminar, explores the contemporary formation of U.S. Latinidad through the racialization of language and its relationship to national identity and politics. The U.S. imaginary, he asserts, relies on space-time narratives that yield a two-part commonly posed question to countless persons who are seen or racialized or interpreted as non-white. And what are those two questions? One, where are you from? Second, no, where are you really from? These questions, in terms of the sonic, right, in terms of how we amplify this notion, reveal, as Rosa argues, how one's racially overdetermined body, which is primordially anchored in some imagined foreign elsewhere, beyond our borders, that body needs to be accounted for. That's what's happening right now in my home city right now, in the city of Chicago. And so, relatedly and significantly, crossing this threshold of a border, right, to be accounted for, it exceeds place. It opens up an extension beyond a boundary. It is a bridge. A bridge is a connection called up by desire. And what is that desire? They're quite simple, usually, right? A desire to move, a desire to reunite, a desire to make a living, a desire to provide. Right? It's a desire to go so that a return can come into being. That's a crossing. Right? It's a necessary trajectory. It's when your own body loosens and you feel a connection with another person, another place, a verse or a melody, and both of you are affected. The other next to you. It's what the space of performance calls into being. The story conveyed, the emotion elicited, the echoes of meaning that touch you. Correspondingly, for instance, what you see here, the sounding of Huapango Arribeño, the music you just heard and that you see represented here. So just quickly, this is in Central Texas. You see the musicians on the right, and they are serenading two quinceañera courts as they're arriving to the reception. Right? These sounds touch you. They move you, both physically, right? Because you hear it, and you want to dance to it, you want to move. But they touch you emotively as well. Think moved to tears. These sounds touch whom they surround in the moment. But they also reach out, cross, pulling in those far away, fulfilling desires for intimacy, invoking people and locations similarly remembered and imagined far away. So those people in Central Texas are from this place. And so then if we think about these distant locations and the politics that divide them, we may begin thinking about all the possibilities that could be bridged across borders. What connections might these bridges entail? And this question for me has always related less to the result of having crossed, right? But rather to the bridge itself, the moment of crossing with all of its intensities, the present tenseness of it all, the collapsing of place through imaginings that reach out and suddenly drag people and places into view. When adjacencies occur and when people and places suddenly fold together. And I continue to ask, what does this crossing sound like? And in this regard, my most current and long-term arts research project, Sonorous Present, attends to this question. It was created through a collaborative, immersive, and ethnographic research-based process with something at stake. It is a suite of compositions that meditates on the borderlands and border crossing through sound and memory. Another one of my field sites. Now, admittedly, ethnography, right, as an anthropologist, ethnography is an affective experience, right? It's always in tension with the seemingly elusive attempt to render the feeling of being there, right? You want to have people in the moment in textual form. I would argue that songwriting is not too dissimilar. Yet in being less script-centric, it opens up the possibility of translating and expressing experience through sonic and performative registers. So ultimately, Sonorous Present, it's an album. It's a suite of compositions that integrates my experiences as an artist, as a musician, as an ethnographer in order to reimagine the forms scholarship should take, and in some ways with little regard to disciplinary distinctions. And in this way, it puts on display the possibilities of what people are calling now multi-modal scholarship and ethnographic songwriting to expand our understanding of what arts-based methodologies can achieve. And similar to conventional ethnography, an album requires what? Refinement, right? Attention to production. Quote, if ethnography is understood not as a science, but as an interpretive art, that's Christina Jacobson, then it is in the interpretation and the craft of writing about a life world with compassion, with depth and nuance, where the greatest skill and challenge arguably lies, end quote. So as narrative-based forms of storytelling that pay close attention to the senses, right, ethnography and songwriting, and follow rules about form and structure and genre, I think they share much in common. Now for the hardcore anthropologists in here, right? That, just, disclaimer that anthropology has long been preoccupied with the adjacent creative world of poetry. Right? So we think about Boaz's discussion of the importance of investigating poetry in the Handbook of American Indian Languages, Sapir's emphasis on the role of sound in aesthetic and poetic practice, Zoronio Hurston's creative play with genres and poetics, to the ethnopoetic analysis of Tedlock and Himes, and of course, like most recently, the work of Ruth Behar and Renato Rosaldo. Those latter two often are referred to as anthropoetas in terms of how they write. So I think ethnographic songwriting is just another step in this kind of creative, engaged direction. But by contrast, it is a more recent phenomenon, but it is, defined as songwriting informed by or collaboratively written with one's interlocutors. It's poetry set to sound and song. And in my case, my ethnographic songwriting was an attempt to touch on the topic and politics of immigration, as I described before, to sort of kind of set that up. Source the sounds of regional Mexican and Latin American folk traditions. At a personal level, honor the memories of my family members that have passed and their migrant stories, and connect this world of personal story and sound to my long-standing research on both sides of the U.S. Mexico border. And so to quote one of my collaborators on this album, Roger Reeves, a acclaimed poet, look him up. He's a dear friend. I love him to death. And he says, often we think of elegies as commemorations, as moments of sadness. But really, an elegy is about the praise of something. You can't mourn something you don't love. And so like me, and like many, I'm imagining most of you here, particularly in our kind of post-lockdown moment, and all that entailed for all of us, that a fair amount of trauma lives in all of us. I know it lives in me, and most of it concerns death and dying. So, my sister, older sister, who was a fatal victim of domestic violence, gunned down in my family's home when I was 11. My mother, who died suddenly in Mexico 16 years ago, and my father, who also died just suddenly a little over 2 years ago. Now this, it seems, for me has shaped much of what I've created over the years as an artist. And why? Because nothing is really quite what it seems when you're mourning, right? And this often is so because this proper space to grieve escapes you. Right? In those moments, at least for me, I found myself taking care of the people around me, or being strong for everyone else, or keeping it together for them, right? And so then I realized early on I had to hold space for myself somewhere else. And so I started to create through loss. And that's been most of my life. And so, because I think that art bears witness. Art bears witness to how life unfolds as this sort of relational universe of both individual and collective experiences. And I don't think, mourning is one of those sort of kinds of experiences. It's quite individual, but it's very much collective. So art, and for our purposes, music and sound and songwriting, right, can intervene across this social surround, across literal and figurative borders. And what are those? Like literal borders, right? The divides of nations, states, sure, or a figurative border. The threshold between life and death. Art bears witness. Art takes up the call to elevate the seemingly ordinary, like grief or mourning, those moments when you feel the lump in your throat, the knot in your chest, when your knees buckle, when your chin trembles, that hollow stomach, right? And so over these past few years, particularly in the wake of COVID-19 and the death of my father, I crafted a suite of compositions, sonic, ethnographic, informed by research and personal story attuned to my own grief. Sonorous. Capable of sound, in the offing, present, occurring now, and permanent, or as gift. And so for me, Sonorous Present, as a kind of undertaking, it is a eulogy. It's an apology. It's a provocation. It's an oral history. It's a composition. It's fiction, confession, meditation, an offering, an attempt, an inclination, a center, an edge, a border, a break. Thinker, writer, philosopher Fred Moten speaks to us about the break. This epistemological breach where we construct another possible world or worlds, often through art. Words that offer political possibility. The break in which broken bodies dwell or defy or endure or refuse or bear witness, but hopefully where bodies heal. So Sonorous Present, this suite of compositions, these songs, to think about a break, they broke my heart. It was very difficult to create through that. But I think, honestly, it's good to dwell in heartache sometimes. Right? I don't think we allow ourselves that space enough. And so, Sonorous Present invites listeners into this space, this break, to meditate, to mourn, to celebrate a memory. Because, right, these aesthetic enactments, right, these songs or sounds, they put on display our lived-in worlds. It's imaginative, it's contingent, it can be improvisational. They are experiments that amplify the resonance of memories. This is what, to return to one of our foundational theorists here, Gloria Anzaldúa elsewhere describes as conocimiento. She says, skeptical of reason and rationality, conocimiento questions conventional knowledge's current categories, classifications, and contents. Conocimiento is reached via creative acts. Right? We write, art making, both mental and somatic, right? The body, too, is a form as well as a site of creativity. That these ideas ground theory in everyday life, our own experiences that interweave art or history or worlds and the self to form the basis of what she then terms auto, historia, teoria. She continues. Autohistoria is a term I use to describe the genre of writing about one's personal and collective history using fictive elements, a sort of fictionalized autobiography or memoir. And autohistoria teoria is a personal essay that theorizes. And so this includes and expands, in my opinion, beyond ethnography, particularly as an anthropologist, right? That this is about theorizing or thinking or creating at the margins of scholarly convention. Opening up a bridge between art and scholarship, voicing knowledges and experiences that open up sites of struggle and connection. Always cite your sources, right? Sonorous Present is very much inspired by these ideas. And they didn't start in that way, but as I was working through it, I recognized, oh, I'm tapping into something that other people have tapped into. And so, let's go back to Central Texas here. My life's work, my ethnographic engagements concern practices of amplifying, surveilling, or displacing sound, particularly as these intersect with histories of migration and Latinos in the United States. In other words, sonic encounters. And I've approached these topics with an interest, yes, in sound and aurality, but in the borderlands to consider what sonorous phenomena abound or resonate as you move through or across borders. And as we listen, what assumptions are we making? What aural connections are we making? And how might all of this evidence the way that sound simultaneously appears as a force that constitutes the world and a medium for constructing our knowledge about the world? Returning to the U.S. Mexico border. Anti-immigrant rhetoric really sort of performs a cultural work of positioning migrants, particularly from Latin America and the global south, outside of the national boundaries of belonging. And my ethnographic engagements have borne witness to this kind of spectacular terror, particularly with these musicians that you see here. I mean, these are musicians who were largely undocumented at the time, and work that I did and I published. Yet beyond telling the story of that kind of fear, in a country that dispossesses, a lot of what these stories were about as well were about voicing intimacy, struggle, the ordinary, or as Gilberto Rosas describes, making dead in order to live. He says, making dead in order to live is part of a project of documenting and expressing contemporary brutalities without exacerbating the obscene suffering of border crossers, so that we analyze, recognize, and ultimately struggle against violence and oppression, both spectacular and mundane. Making dead to let live is attuned, I think, end quote, so, is attuned to conditions of existence at the margin, wherein those subjected as illegal or etc. are socially and materially or discursively positioned closer and closer to death in order that they may live. In order that they may live. This is my mother, West Texas, 1974. In order that they may live. So although most of my immediate family, my mother, my father, my older sister, they're all dead, they lived. They survived the border. And their stories of crossing always seemed impossible to me. My mother, she crossed in Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, El Paso, in the trunk of a car. My father, he crossed in Ojinaga, Chihuahua, after a week-long trek in the dead of winter, back when it used to snow in that part of the world. They lived. And these stories have long become a part of me, and over the years, sounds have attached themselves to them. And Sonorous Present is a culmination of these memories. It chronicles this universe of story, of family, of borders, of loss, of migration through sound, lyric, poetry, theory, verse, ethnography, autohistoria, and rhythm. And so what began as an experimental, collaborative, and improvised performance in 2019, inspired by the music and poetics of my book, Sounds of Crossing, was subsequently reimagined as a studio album in collaboration with Grammy Award-winning producer Quetzal Flores. So this album is recorded both in Los Angeles and Chicago, and it explores Mexican, regional, Latin American sounds and traditions, but it's also deepened, or those sounds are deepened by kind of these avant jazz arrangements, field recordings alongside poems written and recited by, I mentioned before, renowned author and poet Roger Reeves. It features luminaries from the worlds of traditional Mexican song, jazz, and R&B, including Aloe Black. I'm pretty sure most of you know songs that he's written. Marta Gonzalez, 2022 MacArthur Fellow, and again Roger Reeves, among many others. So the weight of all of that, and writing and recording it, I think really provided an avenue to explore co-creative methods alongside producer Quetzal Flores. So let me tell you a little bit about him, okay? Quetzal Flores, he's a Grammy Award-winning producer, he's a composer, musician, and an activist from East Los Angeles. He is the founder and artistic director of the award-winning East LA band Quetzal, and he previously worked with the Alliance for California Traditional Arts, ACTA, where he co-designed the Arts and Corrections program, where traditional artists from across the state cultivated spaces for healing with incarcerated people. And he has immersed himself in a range of communities of practice over the years, but perhaps most intensely in spaces with artists exploring the centuries-old Afro-Mestizo music culture of son jarocho, native to the state of Veracruz. And so with Quetzal, you hear an activist and an artist who brings to bear years of study and training in an array of Afro-diasporic and Latin American musical styles. You hear the turmoil and urgency in the wake of the 1992 Los Angeles urban rebellion, the sort of swirling social moment out of which Quetzal as a band emerges. And you hear an archive of creative exploration, collective memory, and personal history from Veracruz, Mexico to Los Angeles, California, binding together the likes of bands like Los Lobos and Osomatli. Now, beneath the surface of what we were able to craft exists a well of musical and cultural reference that, with the aid of Quetzal, was always in play, as we both pushed at the edges of traditional sounds and ethnography. We electrified traditional instruments. We recorded, sampled, and looped the zapateado dance, right, the footwork directly from the wooden platform, stomp box. We reinterpreted Mexican rhythms and other kinds of time signatures. We combined traditional instruments with seemingly disparate elements and incorporated field recordings from my research into the sonic and compositional scaffolding of several songs. So I want to play something for you. You'll see Roger and Quetzal talk a little bit about that particular bit of it, about the ethnographic sort of field recordings in relation to the songwriting. So, poetically, so one of the people that I got to collaborate with, I think most intimately, was Roger Reeves, poet, who is a dear friend, someone I admire, someone I respect, and someone who I love. A lot of his poetry and his voice, literal voice, they're on the album, they're on the record.
Becomes the poverty that is the end to any story. If we go on, even the dirt. Alex asked me to be part of the project, and this was before the pandemic. Then the pandemic happened. And we just met on Zoom, we called each other, and he kind of described what he was trying to do again, and that is really think about the diverse musics and influences that he has, sort of combine them in an improvisatory sort of fashion where we have sort of that jazz form sort of playing out. And he asked me to write some poems, and I said, okay. He says, but what I want you to do in the writing of the poems is actually don't write too much before. I want you to come to the studio, feel the music, feel the recordings, and write there. And I just prepared like scraps of poems, things that had different lengths of time, different ways of thinking about poetry and the music that I was encountering. So some of the sonic and poetic themes that were strung through the music that sort of gave the project its cohesion was using the ethnographic sound work that Alex had done from his book. So he had sounds of him, for instance, walking in an early morning when the bird calls. And one of the things that I was interested in doing was taking a lot of the sort of sonic material that he had from those ethnographic moments in Mexico and really writing into because there was a lot of space.
So these strategies were integral, as Roger Reeves mentions, to our kind of multi-modal approach to songwriting as ethnographic and ethnography as aesthetic. All part of a sonic border-crossing methodology through which we explored a world of sonic possibility. I think really unachievable through conventional means alone. And so, to begin to conclude here, I want to work you through one example and then leave you with some questions. So, this is one of my field sites where a festival happens every year. And it is a festival that lasts all night. So in the context of, like I said, I'll talk more about my specific research around this music tomorrow. But long story short, these performances, particularly this one that happens on New Year's Eve into New Year's Day, begins midnight when the church bells ring and lasts till noon the next day. Okay, so you've got 12 hours of performance. And so I, after doing this work for many years, there are often times when I'm encountered, particularly doing field work back then, it was like, now I get to go and hang out, I get to just, But back then I was just sitting there recording for like 18, 12 hours, right? As a good ethnographer should do. But there were sometimes these moments where like I would hear something, some sort of inspired moment where like my hairs would stand up. And there was one particularly, and by the way, that's a musician I did the Smithsonian Folkways record with, right? Guillermo Velasquez. In his hometown, New Year's Day, this is about 4 in the morning. And so, this looping violin melodies. This particular figure I'd never heard, and it struck me. Putting a pin in it, like, oh, that's Quetzal as a producer. That's why you bring someone in like that to help you think and solve problems, right? Like you're thinking about something, but you have a perspective on it, but here's someone who can sort of, in a way, sort of expand your understanding of it. One of his first suggestions was like, so hey, like, do you have field recordings? I'm like, yes, of course, but I have like hundreds of hours. He said, great. Bring some of those that you, for whatever reason, are meaningful to you. It could be music, an interview, whatever it is. And so I did, and I bought up several, and we spent days kind of working through them and thinking about them, and I was telling the stories about them and all the rest. And so he was like, great. When I played him this and I told him kind of the context of it, he was like, okay, let's work with that. And so what he did, he's like, okay, well, this is very like kind of hip hop production. He was like, let's take a bit of it, let's tune it, particularly the key that we want to be in, and let's set it to a particular BPM, and let's just loop it. And he's like, now go right. So again, this is what you just heard, right? So this is what he did. I lived with this for months, and it still gives me chills to kind of just listen to that. And he's just like, go right. So if you see this, so what I sort of came up with was like, well, there's an aspect of, particularly in this context of ethnographic songwriting, where you incorporate the sort of scaffolding of these sonics, right? This case, this field recording, right? That already bring you there. So when you hear this, you're already there at 4 in the morning in Hichu, Guanajuato, Mexico, in the mountains. So I don't need to write you a song that describes that place necessarily. You're already there. Okay. So if you're already there and you experience what I'm experiencing, the story that came to mind to me is like the sense of elation of being there at 5, 6 in the morning, and all of a sudden you see the sun come up. And you've been there for hours. And before you know it, the sun is up, and there's still a sea of 5,000, 6,000 people dancing. They've been there all night. So you're waking up in the sea, not just dancers, but most of those people in Hichu, Guanajuato, New Year's Day are migrants. Many of them undocumented. Right? So my thought was like, well, as you're in that moment, to personify the sun, what would the sun say to you as it's rising and peaking over the mountains? And so I brought in my good friend, Laura Cambron, who's on the record. I was like, okay, I can't sing this alone. And I love her voice. I was like, can you help me do this? She was like, yes. So I want to play this for you. It's short. It's not very long. But it is that sample. You'll recognize it. And there are translations up here. But what would the sun say to you? How do these sort of, the guitars you hear mimic in some ways church bells, etc., etc.? So. The Dando los Días as a title, giving the days is the literal translation, but that is actually a poetic décima tradition from this part of the world, New Mexico, Colorado, where it's about how you welcome the day through poetic verse, right? In some ways that's this, and I apologize, I realized right now the translations were there, but we can talk about it after. But largely the story there is like, what would the sun tell you as it's coming up, right? And it's sort of gifting you with a shower of verses. That it's in some ways that its sun rays are miracles, right? And to me, as I think about those moments, not just of music and performance, But being in that community, which is transnational, and all the politics as that entails, as I've mentioned before, the sort of weight of that, one, and its undeniable beauty, right? And so, in my writing and in my songcraft, one question remains a constant, a concern that has long shaped my thinking, and that question is, what makes this sound possible? An adjacent query emerges in response. What are the possibilities of this sound? Sonorous Present attends to the landscape of these questions and ideas, telling of migrant lives lived across seemingly disparate places through sound, song, poetry, rhythm, and lyric. And to conclude, and to return to a kind of something I mentioned earlier, that it is a particular set of sounds and sort of compositional sort of effort that rests in the break. To heal, to mourn, to remember, to enact an analytical push away from normative analysis of what counts as research within, let's say, anthropology or other allied disciplines and other dominant knowledge formations. That resting in the break is an attempt at sounding out at the possibilities of the unrecognized, of the unheard, and thus carries with it long-standing legacies, as, in my case, minoritarian subjects of with the dead and constant acts of mourning. Mourning. And so in this case, for me, quite personally, mourning my own dead, right? But I think this can extend to anybody, where it might be personal, political, unconventional, communal, past, present, or future-oriented, that sonorous present ultimately, and perhaps unconventionally, asks us to mourn in common. So, thank you.
Alex, are you game for a few questions?
Of course. Yeah.
Terrific. I'm ready to hand the mic to whomever would like to ask a question.
Well, thank you. I think I followed part of that, Professor. When I heard the music, and I heard this, many of us, I think of our generation, and certainly culturally, a big impact was, I believe it was the Buena Vista Social Club.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And I wondered how you see your work in context of what I think was a real breakthrough in terms of how people heard that music.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, that, to think about folks familiar, Buena Vista, right, Cuban group of legacy artists, really interesting story. I think, you know, I think at least for me, just kind of, as you asked this question, because sometimes I teach about that particular moment in that particular group, is that it brings up two potential things for me. It's like, one, how I think that the kind of popularity of that group in really interesting ways is tied to these much larger questions around memory and nostalgia, particularly as it relates to Cuba, right? And people have written about this in terms of what that means, right? It can be quite polemic, but and that might be the case, but it's still a way of kind of celebrating that music. I think that, you know, wherever that memory is coming from, I think at the end of the day, for me, when I think about a project like that, and yeah, the Raikuder, that was late 90s and early 2000s. A lot of those other records started coming out with Ruben Gonzalez and that kind of stuff. Is that it in some ways, it signals toward this, in some ways relates to memory too, this constant reimagining, or in some ways re-evaluation of Latino music in the United States, right? because it always has these flash moments, and then it's sort of, we kind of have this amnesia around it, right? And then it's like, oh, here it is again, as a kind of a surprise, and it's like, no, there's an entire long history and legacy of this that's been doing that, right? And so I think it's really a matter of like putting like them in the context of like this entire kind of mosaic of people who have been doing music around, or just Latino music, in not just in the U.S., but that's become popular in the U.S. too, right? That I think at the end of the day, and we can go into what all those trajectories are, but like that in the context of what I'm talking about here, when we bring those things up, which is great, is that it reminds us that like, oh yeah, right? There's an entire cultural legacy here that's related to the U.S. that's very much, that tells us what, at the end of the day, this Latino presence in the context of the United States. That, folks aren't newcomers. I mean, folks, we're in Santa Fe. Like I was, that was just like, and I think like we have to often be reminded of that, particularly in this moment where it seems like, but I love that, because I love when I actually got to see Rubén González. I was in college, came to Austin. I was at UT at the time, and I was like, it was great. Yeah.
Thank you. This is rich and fascinating work, but I would like to shift to Chicago today.
Yeah.
Are you and your colleagues studying the corridos, the Chicago style, and are they booming, and are they getting radio play, and will they make a difference?
Yeah. I am not personally. I think there's some grad students that are into the corrido work, to be honest with you, but it's definitely part of one of the genres that is very much part of the soundtrack of particularly younger people, the corridos tumbados, and then stuff that is like more narco stuff, and everything in between. I mean, like John McDowell has written about this in the context of like, there's the kind of hardcore stuff, there's the stuff about remediation, the stuff that's more about storytelling. And in me personally, like, I mean, so my degree's from University of Texas at Austin, so I'm like fourth generation. It's like Americo Perez is the preeminent corrido scholar, is like my great grandfather intellectually. So like that work is like something that I've studied quite a bit, but I went in the direction of studying this music. But I know that people are doing some of that work. I can't speak to it because I don't do it personally, but what I can say is like, I definitely hear corridos when I'm in Pilsen in Little Village in the south side of Chicago. Yeah. And so meaning that it's definitely a particular cultural form that people connect to, right? And the stories that it tells. But I think also frankly, like as a particular kind of sonic cultural, expressive cultural marker of a kind of rebelliousness, right? That I think we make this facile, or have, this facile, I think, kind of comparison to like a rap or something like that, and that's fine. But I mean, it doesn't get any more quote unquote gangster than like 1901 Corrido de Gregorio Cortés, where he shoots down the sheriff in Karnes County. And then the whole corrido is about his adventurous ride to freedom, right? Like in the borderlands. So like this has been a tradition for a long time. And I think that rebelliousness, that youthfulness around how the corrido signifies a particular kind of, to go back to Fred Moten in The Break, what are the other possibilities that art can, sort of imagine, right? In terms of what that is. And that was a very violent world back then, it was over a century ago. But what did people turn to tell that story? The corrido, right? And I think young people today, similarly, in very different contexts, all the rest, are also using the corrido in the same way to identify with. And I think, even more specifically to your question, to think about Chicago, I mean, this is something that like George Lipsitz wrote about, and others, particularly in 1990s, like LA, et cetera, is like where outwardly identifying and playing corridos and identifying that way and dressing that way was very much an act of marking yourself when you were being very much policed. I mean, you think about early 90s and, Prop 187, everything that's happening. I think about now what's happening in Chicago, I mean, literally right now, as we speak. yeah, there's still, young people who are out there like, so what? And that means that for them. And if the corrido is a soundtrack to that, I'm like, yeah, it should be. Of all the musics, like that's the one that should signify a particular kind of refusal or rebelliousness that's there. But I think last thing I'll say is this: when it comes to the city of Chicago, which my current book project is on now, less about music, it's more about sound and aurality. So a lot of it is far more conceptual. But I would just say this, just to level set for us right now, to think about what's happening and Chicago being in the news. We forget how Latino that city is. I think when we think about Latinos in the United States, we often think about Southwest and particularly the coast, right? California, New York, Miami. But Chicago is home, like second, third largest ethnic Mexican population outside, metropolitan-wise, outside of East LA. Sixth largest Latino population. The second largest sort of Puerto Rican diaspora population is there in Chicago, and we don't necessarily imagine Chicago as distinctively that. So there's this huge silence around that, and that's always been interesting to me, which is why I'm writing a book about it, right? But I think that to that end, and our contemporary politics is like, it is on other people's radars, clearly. And that's kind of, in some ways, what explains what's happening right now, to a degree. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for sharing that beautiful song. I really needed to hear that. And I was wondering a little bit about the Sonorous Present and the songs that you have, the other songs that you have in that album. I know that I'm probably gonna have these questions answered if I listen to the album.
Sure.
But it really reminded me of Paso Tono, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with Paso Tono. They're a band from Oaxaca, from the Mixteca region, and I think they might have played at the Smithsonian in the Folk Life.
Yeah, the Folklife Festival, yeah. Sure.
And some of their songs, like yours, they tell stories of migration. And, there's a really famous Mixtec actress, Angeles Cruz, who kind of talks about this extreme profound sadness that she experiences after her son migrates out, and the way that it's embodied in her body. And it sounds like the album is really personal, and it really goes, I'm imagining that each song might be about your family members, and I'm kind of wondering, a little bit about like having a preview of what those songs are about, and also the influence, and also the kind of style that you chose. Is it all, the genre of the music is Arribeño? I missed the first word.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if it's all the same type of genre, or if you actually were influenced by the different artists that you chose, Aloy Black, who does, I guess, like hip hop and R&B, but then Quetzal, who does the son jarocho. So it's kind of thinking about like the different influences, if you kind of stuck to one, or if you, were influenced by various of those. So a lot of questions there, but I'll
try to distill that. So not familiar with that first artist. Second, I will talk way more. If you're around tomorrow morning, we're gonna go through a bunch of the songs on the record, to go through the stories and the sonics and what they are, to kind of get in the specifics of that. But I think to level set with respect to like what are the influences, I suppose. My assumed kind of musical heritage has been kind of Huapango music, where it's Arribeño or Huasteco, right? But working with Quetzal, as producer, both of us, we've done all kinds of stuff, right? He does son jarocho, so have I. That guy does rock and R&B. I mean, he comes from that legacy of East LA music that, come on, right? From Richie Valens, to like Los Lobos, right? So like that's a huge history. And then me, myself, coming from Texas, and my own family history from Mexico, but we have over time really studied musics, studied traditions, and when we came together, I think to answer your question, knowing that these are kind of what we're informed by. When we came together to, me asking like, hey, would you want to produce? One of the first of all, he was like, yeah, let's do it, right? Which I was touched by, because he was like, man, I've been waiting to do something with you. Because we've collaborated in different ways in the past and all the rest, but then when he was like, yes, I'm in, okay, I was touched by that. And one of the first things that we did, we just sat down and talked. Like, so what do you hear? Or what stories are you wanting to sort of convey, and what kind of are the kind of sonic contours of that? So his idea of like bringing field recordings and that kind of thing. But to your point specifically musically, what we sort of landed was like, okay, this is very like kind of in the weeds kind of music production stuff, which is like, okay, we have to really land on a sonic palette here. And so one of the things was like, okay, this is all going to be an acoustic record, basically, with the exception of a few other elements, but there's that. Another is like whatever percussion is there is all going to be hand percussion, so it's all bata, Cuban bata. There's, congas and stuff like that. But when you listen to the record, and there are elements there that sound like drums, it's not drums. What it is Marta Gonzalez and her feet on the tarima. Right, that we again, to try to make that acoustic, like, so we recorded her, and then we looped it, and we, sort of produced it in a particular way to give it a particular kind of affect. And so choosing that kind of sonic palette for us was one big discussion. Then the second was really like, well, what are the songs? What are the stories? Some of them I had already brought to the table. Some of them we created together. Some were, improvised. But like we did that, but we kind of stayed within the parameters of like, okay, if we're only using these instruments, really, then this is a kind of lane that we're in. So it's pseudo Huapango, pseudo jarocho, pseudo nueva canción. It's kind of undefined, but it's definitely those elements. So I think that we sort of landed there, and it was kind of last thing I'll say is this. For us, it was really this sort of really wonderful exercise in restraint. Because we can play all these things. And we're like, but no, we're not going to put all this on like every song. We could do all this stuff and put jaranas and all this stuff. Like, well, that's fine, but that's not, no. Like, what serves the story or the song, right? So something as simple as like, hey, here's this amazing little bit of like music that I want to loop for you, and just go right to it. And then like, oh, then I'll put a couple elements on there, and like that's it. Like it was just sort of it's quite delicate in that regard. So to your point, like, is that Huapango Arribeño? I mean, kind of, yeah, but like not really. But it's definitely like inspired by that. And I think for us, that's kind of part of what we were trying to do. And last thing I'll say is this: if you are interested, I've learned to do this now. So if you're interested in a vinyl, there it is there. But you can stream it there as well, okay?